The year was 1888, and London was a city of contrasts. The British Empire was at its zenith, its influence stretching across the globe. The West End glittered with wealth and sophistication, its grand theaters, luxurious mansions, and gaslit streets a testament to the prosperity of the age. But to the east, in the district of Whitechapel, life was far grimmer. Here, the streets were narrow and filthy, the air thick with the stench of poverty and despair. Tenements overflowed with families crammed into single rooms, and the alleys were haunted by the desperate and the destitute. It was in this shadowy, labyrinthine world that one of history's most infamous figures would emerge, Jack the Ripper. To understand the story of Jack the Ripper, one must first understand the world in which he operated. Whitechapel was a place of extreme poverty and overcrowding. The Industrial Revolution had brought thousands of people to London in search of work, but the city was ill-equipped to handle the influx. Housing was scarce, and many families lived in squalid conditions, sharing cramped rooms with multiple relatives or even strangers. The district was also a hub of crime and vice. Prostitution was rampant, as many women turned to the trade out of sheer desperation. Alcoholism was widespread, and the streets were patrolled by gangs and petty criminals. The police were often overwhelmed, and the justice system was harsh but inconsistent. For the poor and marginalized, life in Whitechapel was a daily struggle for survival. It was against this backdrop that the Ripper murders took place. The killer's victims were all women who had fallen through the cracks of society, forced to live on the margins in order to survive. Their deaths would expose the dark underbelly of Victorian London, a world of inequality and injustice that many preferred to ignore. The story of Jack the Ripper begins on the morning of August 31, 1888. The sun had not yet risen when a cart driver named Charles Cross made a gruesome discovery in Bucks Row, a dimly lit street in Whitechapel. Lying in the gutter was the body of a woman, her throat slit so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. Her name was Marian Nichols, a 43-year-old prostitute who had been struggling to survive in the harsh streets of London. Marian Nichols had not always lived such a hard life. Born in 1845, she had married a printer named William Nichols and had 5 children with him. But the marriage had fallen apart, and Nichols had been forced to turn to prostitution to support herself. By 1888, she was living in a common lodging house in Whitechapel, a place where the poorest of the poor could rent a bed for a few pence a night. On the night of her murder, Nichols had been out drinking and had been turned away from her lodging house because she did not have the 4 pence needed for a bed. She had last been seen alive just an hour before her body was found, drunkenly wandering the streets in search of clients. Her death marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would grip London for months to come. The police were called, and the investigation began. The brutality of the murder shocked even the hardened officers of the Metropolitan Police. The killer had not only slit Nichols' throat, but had also inflicted deep, jagged wounds to her abdomen. It was a level of violence that seemed almost inhuman. The newspapers, eager for sensational stories, dubbed the killer Leather Apron, a nickname inspired by rumors of a local man who terrorized prostitutes. But this was only the beginning. Just over a week later, on September 8, 1888, another body was found. This time, the victim was Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who had turned to prostitution after her husband's death left her destitute. Her body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, a tenement building in the heart of Whitechapel. Like Nichols, Chapman's throat had been cut, but the killer had gone further this time. Her abdomen had been slashed open, and her uterus had been removed with surgical precision. Annie Chapman's life had been one of hardship and tragedy. Born Eliza Ann Smith in 1841, she had married a coachman named John Chapman and had 3 children with him. But her husband's death in 1886 had left her with no means of support, and she had drifted into prostitution. By the time of her murder, she was living in a lodging house on Dorset Street, one of the most notorious slums in London. The murder of Annie Chapman sent shockwaves through the community. The killer was not just a murderer but a mutilator, someone who took pleasure in desecrating the bodies of his victims. The police were baffled. How could someone commit such atrocities in a crowded neighborhood without being seen? The killer seemed to move like a ghost, vanishing into the foggy streets after each crime. The terror reached its peak on the night of September 30th, 1888, a night that would come to be known as the Double Event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant who had been living in Whitechapel for years. Her body was found in Dupfield's Yard, a small courtyard off Berner Street. Unlike the previous victims, Stride's body showed no signs of mutilation. Her throat had been cut, but the killer appeared to have been interrupted before he could carry out his usual ritual. Elizabeth Stride, known as Long Liz to her friends, had led a difficult life. Born in Sweden in 1843, she had moved to London in the 1860s and had worked as a domestic servant before turning to prostitution. She had been married to a ship's carpenter named John Stride, but the marriage had ended in separation. By 1888, she was living in a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, one of the most dangerous areas in Whitechapel. Just an hour later, less than a mile away, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old woman with a history of petty crime and alcoholism. Her body was discovered in Mitre Square, a quiet corner of the city. The killer had been far more thorough this time. Eddowes' throat was slit, her face was mutilated, and her abdomen was cut open. Her kidney and uterus had been removed, and part of her ear had been sliced off. The killer had also left a chilling message on the wall nearby, written in chalk. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The message was quickly erased by the police, who feared it would incite anti-Semitic riots in the already tense neighborhood. Catherine Eddowes, like the other victims, had lived a life of hardship. Born in 1842, she had been in and out of workhouses and prisons for much of her life. She had been in a long-term relationship with a man named John Kelly, but the couple had often been separated due to their poverty and instability. On the night of her murder, Eddowes had been released from police custody after being arrested for drunkenness. She had been seen wandering the streets just hours before her death. The last and most gruesome murder occurred on November 9, 1888. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old woman who lived in a small room at 13 Miller's Court. Unlike the previous victims, Kelly was killed indoors, in the privacy of her own home. When her landlord grew suspicious of the silence from her room, he peered through the window and was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Kelly's body lay on the bed, but it was barely recognizable. Her throat had been cut, and her body had been completely eviscerated. Her face was slashed beyond recognition, her organs had been removed and placed around the room, and her heart was missing. The room was a blood-soaked nightmare, a testament to the killer's utter depravity. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the Ripper's victims, and her murder marked the end of the killing spree. Little is known about her early life, but she was believed to have been born in Ireland and had worked as a prostitute in London. She had been living with a man named Joseph Barnett, but the couple had recently separated due to financial difficulties. Kelly's murder was the most brutal of all, and it left the community in a state of shock and fear. The murders sent London into a frenzy. The police were under immense pressure to catch the killer, but their efforts were hampered by the limitations of forensic science at the time. Fingerprinting was not yet in use, and DNA analysis was decades away. The killer left behind few clues, and the only witnesses were those who had glimpsed shadowy figures in the foggy streets. The media played a significant role in shaping the public's perception of the killer. Newspapers published sensational stories, often exaggerating the details of the crimes and speculating wildly about the killer's identity. The name, Jack the Ripper, first appeared in a letter sent to the Central News Agency, supposedly written by the killer himself. The letter, filled with taunts and threats, was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." While the authenticity of the letter is still debated, the name stuck, and Jack the Ripper became a household name. The police pursued numerous suspects, but none could be definitively linked to the crimes. Among the most notable suspects were Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who was found dead shortly after the last murder. Some believed his suicide was an admission of guilt. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and hairdresser who was later committed to an asylum. Some modern investigators have suggested that DNA evidence points to him, but the theory remains controversial. Prince Albert Victor, a member of the royal family, this theory was fueled by rumors of scandal and cover-ups, though it is widely discredited. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a history of violence against women. He was arrested during the investigation but escaped custody and fled to the United States. Despite the efforts of the police and the public, Jack the Ripper was never caught. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. The story of Jack the Ripper has endured for over a century, captivating the imaginations of people around the world. The mystery of his identity has inspired countless books, films, and television shows, each offering its own theory about who he might have been. The case has also had a lasting impact on criminal investigations, leading to advancements in forensic science and police procedures. But beyond the mystery, the story of Jack the Ripper is a reflection of the social and economic conditions of Victorian London. The victims were not just statistics. They were women who had been pushed to the margins of society, forced to live in poverty and desperation. Their deaths exposed the dark underbelly of a city that prided itself on its progress and prosperity. To this day, the name Jack the Ripper evokes a sense of fear and fascination. He remains a shadowy figure, a phantom who vanished into the foggy streets of Whitechapel, leaving behind a legacy of terror and mystery. The question of who he was may never be answered, but the story of his crimes continues to haunt us, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human heart.